Alrighty, howdy. Thank you everyone for joining. Having some summer-like weather, so we're going to be talking about a summertime crop. We're going to be talking about blueberries today, so hopefully everyone's hungry, excited. I know I am. My name's Tim Hartman. I'm a program specialist with Texas A&M AgriLife Extension Service, and we're going to be talking today about how to grow these beautiful plants, about how to actually grow your own blueberries. It can be done. It's actually very easy. We'll talk about some of the things. There are a few key factors that have to be met, but otherwise it's really one of the easiest fruits to grow. So we'll be walking you through all those different aspects today. So you can see right here we've got some ripe fruit. This is the variety Climax. It's a really old variety. It's not a real heavy yielder, but it's probably my favorite as far as flavor. To me, I was just telling Lisa, who's filming for us today, Lisa Whittlesey, we have behind the screen, and I was telling her these kind of almost have like a mango or a peach hint, in my opinion. To me, they have a really good flavor. We've also...
So let's wait just a minute. Oh. We still have some people kind of grabbing online.
Oh, I was just...
So, you might remind them we have our experts online, Tim.
Oh yeah, thank you. Yeah. So yeah, thanks Lisa. So today, remember, we have this is live, of course, but this is going to also be recorded. Okay, so if you're not able to watch, if you have to step away, or maybe I talk too fast, or there's something you want to revisit later, you can always go back and watch again. But we also have our expert panel who is here to answer questions. So if you have a question, feel free to type it in the comment box, and someone will get it. We've got, and I apologize in advance if I'm leaving anyone out, but I know we have Greg Grant from Smith County, the Tyler area. We've got Kim Benton from Cherokee County. We've got our East Texas folks out there who I know all about blueberries. Who else? I believe we have Beth McMahon out from Fredericksburg. I believe Dr. Larry Stein from Uvalde. Do you know if I'm missing anyone?
I don't know. If you guys can put who's on in the comment box, that would be great. I see Greg on. That's awesome.
And of course we have Paul Pleasant, who's making us look good behind the scenes, making all this happen. So we want to thank him for everything he's doing. By the way, before we get going, we have a fairly new, up-to-date Aggie Horticulture fact sheet on blueberries. Talks about everything I'm going to talk about today, everything you need to know. And so I believe the link will be posted later on, but feel free to peruse this later on. And so I'll be referring to this publication several times today too. So
okay, I think we're about ready, Tim.
Alrighty, so again, we're talking today about growing blueberries in containers. My name is Tim Hartman with the Texas A&M AgriLife Extension Service. It is definitely summer. You can ask anyone out here. If you look around in the garden, actually, you'll notice that pretty much everyone is in the shade because it is hot. It's humid here in College Station. It feels like summer, so we're going to be talking about a summertime fruit. So we know that blueberries are wonderful fruit. They're by many people regarded as number one in terms of fruit for their antioxidant capacity. Lots of anthocyanins, lots of good stuff. They've got fiber, they've got lots of other things going on. And in Texas, we actually have a decent industry. It's somewhere around 1,000 acres of commercial blueberry industry. Of course, almost all of that is in East Texas, where the soil is acidic. It has naturally low pH. We have lots of rain. We have sandy soils. And so that's where we find most of the production. So we're going to be talking today about how to grow blueberries in areas that maybe is not so conducive to production otherwise. So blueberries are really easy to grow. They have relatively few major pest and disease problems. And for that reason, we don't have to spray them a lot. They're fairly low input. In fact, organic production of this crop is very realistic. So some people regard blueberries as difficult to grow, but it's mainly because of a few key factors. Remember I said they need acid soil, okay? They prefer a soil pH of about 4.0 to 5.5. That's very acid, very tart. It's really more acidic than most plants would prefer. They also need good drainage and good water. Now, blueberries are in the Ericaceae family, the same family as rhododendron and azalea. And if you've ever tried to grow azaleas before, let's say in Austin or San Antonio, you know that they need that acidic soil. Most members of the Ericaceae family do not have the typical root hairs, those fine little tiny root hairs that really help take up water. They actually rely on associations with beneficial mycorrhizal fungi to help them take up the water and nutrients. And sometimes we don't always necessarily have that. So for all of this to work and for the plant to really be happy, we need an acid soil. Now, what's recommended is if you don't have that type of soil, you can go and till in composted pine bark or peat moss. But if you've already got a lot of calcium in the soil, if you're in a caliche soil, say in the hill country, or if you're in really clay soil, you're just beating your head up against the wall. Fortunately, these plants are fairly small. We're talking about a rabbit eye, maybe getting 6 to 10 feet tall in its natural environment under really good conditions. We'll talk about southern highbush, which is another type of blueberry a little later. They're even smaller. And it's a fairly shallow-rooted plant. It's not like a pecan where it has a really big taproot. It's fine-rooted. So they really lend themselves very well to being grown in containers. And so we're going to talk today about how you can grow them in containers. So speaking of that, let's go ahead and talk about pots or containers. So in horticulture, sometimes we use the term containerized or container. That's just a fancy word for growing them in a pot, okay? This is about a 25 or 30 gallon container, just a plain old black container. You can find these different places. If you want a prettier one, you can do that. You could put them in a whiskey barrel, make them more ornamental. I've used a lot of times what we call molasses tubs, like when you feed cattle in the winter time to supplement with the hay that they're getting. You want to make sure you have drain holes on the bottom. So you want to cut out some holes with either a paddle bit or a hole saw, because we have to have drainage. Some people use a 15-gallon pot, 20-gallon pot. You could go up to 45-gallon pots, but I really like this 25 to 30-gallon size here. I've been growing blueberries, the same plants in containers like this for about 15 years and been very successful. Okay, let's talk about soil substrates. So remember, anytime we're growing, it's all about where the roots start. Okay, so I have some samples that kind of fogged up a little bit. I want to show you some different options you have available. Now, you do not want to go and just get soil or field soil, what some people call dirt. It's soil, okay? But you don't want to just go dig up soil out of the ground. It's going to be too heavy, it's going to compact. And remember that blueberries like really acidic soil. So some different options we have here. We have straight peat moss, Canadian peat moss.
Can you put a little bit in your hands?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so y'all can see it a little better. So we have Canadian peat moss. Many people will go and just use this straight 100%. It's naturally acidic. We have here a mixture of about a 50-50 mixture of composted pine bark and that same peat moss. Okay. What I want to mention, I want to caution you though, when you grow in peat moss or this pine bark, is these two materials, especially peat moss, they tend to be very hydrophobic. When they're dry, they're very difficult to get wet again, so you want to soak them, really get them wet before you go and plant in them, because once you fill the pot with them, it's really difficult to get them moistened again. We have here, this is a mixture, a 50-50 mixture of sand. We like to use the coarse masonry type sand, but this is a 50-50 mix of sand and that composted pine bark. We have here a 50-50 mix of peat moss and sand. Okay, so what I want to mention about these materials, pine bark and peat moss are both naturally very acidic. Okay, if you just use regular potting soil, that will work, but most potting soil is going to have lime or dolomitic lime added to it to bring the pH back into that kind of normal 5.5 to 6.5 range. Remember, we want to be 4 to 5.5. We want to be very acidic for this plant. Now, any of these mixtures will work well. However, I personally don't like to use sand because if you think about it, sand is pretty darn heavy, okay? And we're talking about some pretty big pots here too, so when you start dragging around 20 or so, like I have at my house of these guys, it starts to really work on your back. So I prefer to use either composted pine bark or a mixture of pine bark and peat moss. Now one thing that I want to mention though is when you're using a material like this is all organic material, okay? It's going to decompose, it's going to break down, so eventually it's going to essentially disappear. Your volume is going to decrease over time. So that's something to...
Tim, a question came up. When do you change out the soil in your pots? Is that something done yearly, or do you just add to it?
That's a great idea. So, yeah, so the question again is how often do you repot your blueberries? Do you change out the soil, that is, and the blueberries? And really this kind of is true, it's kind of applicable to all containerized woody plants. I typically don't mess with it unless I see the soil volume really start to drop. So if you look at this pot here, this plant has probably been in here for about 3 or 4 years, and you can see, here's my hand, you can see it's dropped about 4 to 6 inches, okay? We've still got a decent volume of soil, of substrate, but once it starts to get down maybe half or something like that, then we definitely want to add to it. Now, most trees don't like to be planted, or shrubs don't like to be planted deeper than they were already growing, okay? So what I would do with this plant, and I don't want to handle it too roughly because it's got fruit on it, but what I would do is turn it over sideways. I would gently pull out the soil with the whole tree, just slide it out, and then I would go ahead and add some soil, add the appropriate amount of soil below it, and then put the shrub with the root ball back on top of it. So if that makes sense, what I'm doing is I'm adding the substrate to the bottom underneath it, not to the top. Now, if you do see some kind of erosion, if you do see a lot of roots showing, then yeah, you may want to add a little bit to the top. Some people will like to go and knock off some of the soil that's on there. You can do that, but I found really with blueberries, you really don't need to. You just need to make sure that you add to make up for what you've lost over time. So great question there. So, all right, so we talked about substrate. Like I said, you can use regular potting soil, but you're just going to be fighting it because what's going to happen, that it's going to be closer to a neutral pH, and it's really going to be too high of a pH. Even though it's below 7, it's not going to be in that 4 to 5.5 range that you want. Now, you could use something like soil sulfur, either pelletized or powdered. What this will do is when water and bacteria are added to it, it'll form sulfuric acid, it'll drop the soil pH, but you got to be really careful with this because it's really easy to overdo it and burn the plants. It's really easier just to start out with a naturally acidic material like this. Okay, let's talk a little more about nutrition. So if we look back here, we have a plant, and you can just kind of make out a little bit of yellow. It's not too bad. I don't really have a good example, which means I guess I'm doing my job growing the plants, but sometimes you'll start to see some iron chlorosis. If you were with us last week, I talked about it on peaches, how the veins stay green, but if you look at the leaf, and I'm going to pull one off, if you were to look at the leaf, you'd see the veins are green, but then everything around there, that inner veinal region is yellow. That tells you that the plant doesn't have iron. Either there's not enough iron in the soil, or the plant cannot take it up, maybe because the soil pH isn't low enough. And so if that does happen, that's when you're going to want to go and add iron. This is an example of a chelated iron. Chelated iron generally works better than iron sulfate, especially if your soil is alkaline. Here's another form of chelated iron, and like I said last week, you can either go mix this up as a drench according to the label, so you can mix a certain amount, let's say 2 teaspoons per gallon, mix that up thoroughly and then pour it, water it in with that, or you can mix it up and spray it on the leaves, and you'll get a quicker response that way. But anyway, so that's how you correct for iron deficiency, iron chlorosis. So let's talk about water. Okay, the other big thing when we're talking about blueberries is water quality. Water is not always the same wherever you go. The water is, it's just what's in the water. Okay, so here in College Station, we do not have the best water. Those of you who have lived here before, you know, some people call it even College Station inland seawater. It has a lot of sodium in it. That's not good for blueberries. Blueberries like very pure, very clean water, if you will. So if we can zoom in, let's look at a couple examples, okay? Let's start with this one. This is a water report, and if you want to get your water tested, it's not expensive. You can send it in with the information on it. Send it to the Soil, Water, and Forage Testing Lab at Texas A&M. The website for that is soiltesting.tamu.edu. Again, that's soiltesting.tamu.edu. Oh,
Yeah, there we go.
all right, there we go, right there. Okay, and you want to send it in pretty quickly. Make sure it's full. Send in the water and tell them what test you want done on it. But here is an actual report, okay? And I'm going to do my best to kind of interpret this upside down. So you get all these different things on there, all these parameters. But what we're really looking at is starting out as calcium, okay? So calcium, along with bicarbonates and carbonates, these are elements, these are compounds that are actually going to raise the pH of your soil, okay? So, yeah, you may start out with a soil that's, 4.5 or something like that, that's right where you want it, but what's going to happen if you have a lot of calcium, a lot of carbonate or bicarbonate, over time, these are going to raise the soil pH. Just the water you're putting on there is actually going to cause the soil pH to go up, okay? So, we don't like to see a lot of this. The other thing to look at here is alkalinity. Alkalinity really tells us more than pH, because alkalinity really gives us an idea of the water's ability to raise the soil pH. Okay, so the higher that number is, the greater its potential for raising your soil pH. Okay.
Is there a certain number that you want to try to stay below on some of these?
Yeah, we can talk about that a little bit later. So let's talk about sodium, okay? Sodium, we have a lot in our water here. Look at this, 428 parts per million. This is at my house out by the river, and that is not good for any kind of horticultural crop. Sodium is toxic to plants. It destroys soil structure, and it also raises soil pH. For blueberries, we want to be below 50 parts per million, okay? Here, this sample, we're 428, so we're about 8.5 times where we'd like to be, okay? So we are way, way too high. So this would not work, certainly not for blueberries. The other thing we're going to look at is conductivity. Conductivity is basically telling you how much total salinity you have in the water. Now, when we talk about salinity in the water, we're not talking about table salt, sodium chloride. There are many other different types of ionic compounds in the water. So for example, in our case, we have a lot of sodium and a lot of bicarbonates. So basically we have a lot of baking soda in the water here in College Station. The higher this conductivity number is, the worse it is, okay? So we want to be below 300. Another thing to look at is the SAR, and this is just telling you basically the balance of bad to good salts, okay? So we want this number to be low, generally below 10, really for most crops, even lower for some. This is 57. This is basically off the chart, as you see here, and it tells you these ones that are very limiting. So this would be bad water for anything, but especially bad water for blueberries. So this would not be an option for us. Now here's another example. This is water from my parents' house in Blanco, out in the hill country. And you see, as you might expect, the water's hard. We have a lot of calcium in it. We have a lot of bicarbonates in it. The sodium's pretty low. That sodium is acceptable, so we're not worried about that. The SAR is really, really low. However, if you look at this, though, look at that conductivity, okay? Remember we said we want to be below 300? We're up around 1630, okay? So even though we don't have a lot of sodium in this water, it has a lot of total salinity. There's just a lot of minerals in this water, basically. And so the problem here, what's going on, is it's very difficult for the plant to pull water out of the soil. The roots are having to fight against all the minerals and to pull that water through osmosis into the root tissue, especially for blueberries. So this would not be good water for us either. So question, what do we do if we have bad water? Do we give up? Do we say, you know what, I'm just going to grow cactus, or I'm going to grow olives or pomegranates or something like that that's salt tolerant? Well, yeah, you may have to in some cases, but it just so happens, if you look over here, we have a large cistern that is catching rainwater off of this pavilion. Rainwater capture is a great way to make sure we can get plenty of good quality water. If you think about it, rainwater has a pH of a basically neutral pH. There's very little of anything in it, so it's essentially pure water. It's available to us for free. Of course, there's more information on Aggie Horticulture about rainwater harvesting, but with rainwater, you've got pure water. And so that's the only way that I'm able to grow blueberries at home. But of course, you know, it doesn't take much work. If you've got a downspout with gutters already, all you got to do is put a barrel or a trash can underneath it. You want to make sure you don't get mosquitoes in it, so you can put screen over it or put mosquito dunks in it. But we want to make sure.
Tim, the rainwaterharvesting.tamu.edu, that's a good site for if they haven't ever done it before.
Thank you. Lisa brought up a good reminder, and that is rainwaterharvesting.tamu.edu. Will tell you everything you want to know about rainwater harvesting. And so again, that is a way, if you're out in San Antonio, you have hard water. If you're in College Station where you have a lot of sodium in the water, this is a way that you can grow stuff like azaleas, orchids, blueberries, whereas you wouldn't be able to grow it otherwise because the water quality is too bad. So water quality, extremely important. It's easy to get it tested. Again, you can go to soiltesting.tamu.edu. So that's water. Another issue with blueberries is that they tend to bloom pretty early, okay? Remember we talked about chilling requirements last week with peaches. So if you look in our fact sheet, I'll have to find the right page. So right there on the second page we've got varieties, and you notice we've got these chill hours. So remember, that is essentially the number of hours below 45 degrees that it takes for each specific variety to adequately get its chilling, its required rest, meet that rest requirement, and bloom and set a full crop. Okay, so we have to have these numbers met. Remember, you can find your location on this chilling map to get an idea of what your average chilling is. So you want to try to select varieties that are close to what you would normally get, which you would average. So, you know, if you average 500 hours, you can go down to 350. You can go up to 650. You don't have to stay right there at 500, but realize the lower you go, the farther you go below your average, the more chance that your plant is going to bloom too early and get damaged by frost. And if the higher you go, the greater the chance that you're not going to get that chilling most years, okay? Now, one thing that's unique about blueberries is once they get this chilling, once they get their rest requirements satisfied, they very quickly start breaking bud. They waste no time, okay? So they really want to come out early. And so this is a material that I really like to use. There are many manufacturers. This one happens to be DeWitt. You can find these at your co-op, your nursery. You can order it online. This is a frost blanket, also known as floating row cover, and it's kind of a polyurethane, I believe, type material, and it's insulating kind of like a sheet. Okay, you don't want to use plastic. Plastic is not going to help you, and you can do multiple layers of this. And this, depending on how thick, there's different weights, can buy you as much as 5 to 7 degrees protection, especially if you do multiple layers. It also depends on how much wind you have. Now, let's say we're going to try to protect this plant. We want to completely cover it, and I may not have enough material to do that here. I think it's doubled over. Yeah, it's doubled over. But when you cover these plants, and again, the fact that these are small really makes it easier to protect. It's really difficult to do this on something like a peach, full-grown peach. You want to make sure that the edges of this material are touching the ground, okay? We don't wrap it under the bottom and do what we call a lollipop type approach. We want to make this, we want contact all the way to the ground, because what you're actually doing is you are trapping the heat that's coming out of the soil that's being released, and you're capturing it like a hot air balloon, basically, and that's what's going to keep you warmer. Monty Nesbitt has a really good fact sheet on frost protection. That's at the AgriLife bookstore. You can get it for free, printed out. But this is a good way to protect our plants, okay? Anything below 28 degrees, by the way, is going to kill the flowers and the young fruit on blueberries. So that's one of the other problems is fall frost. But again, pretty easy to protect these plants. Let's talk about pests and disease a little bit. We have a few minor issues We have fruit flies. There is a new fruit fly called spotted wing Drosophila. We don't really have that to deal with too much yet. There are blueberry maggots. There's blossom blight caused by we have a few kind of fungal problems. The main one, anthracnose, can sometimes cause some issues on leaves. We can have some fruit drop, but usually these are not going to be major problems for us as homeowners. The big problem we're going to have typically are other animals. Okay, so these things are tasty, they're good. Other animals realize that, and so as you can see here, birds, it's really not so much the blue jays. My experience, it's the mockingbirds. They're the ones that really like to go after our beautiful fruit. I guarantee if I looked on here, I could find a fruit that has a peck in it. And unfortunately, mockingbirds, it's like they're always doing taste tests. They'll peck one hole and then they'll go to another fruit and peck another hole. You know, if they would just finish a single fruit, you know, that wouldn't be so bad. Here's an example of one that you can see. There's the hole there where they pecked it, and of course it just shriveled up, and that's it. They also tend to knock a lot of fruit off when they're doing their pilfering. So the humane way to keep them off is this bird netting. You can see here, this is an example of it. You can get it in different sizes. We use this for grapes and other small fruit crops. You want, if possible, to actually build some kind of frame around this thing. If you just simply lay the bird netting over the plant, what's going to happen? The plant is going to grow through it. It's going to be a nightmare. The other thing is snakes actually tend to get wrapped up in this material pretty easily. And of course, you know, that's just gross all to begin with. And then they die and they stink. And anyway, so my experience, if you can build a structure like this, you're not going to have as much problems with snakes either.
With PVC.
Yeah. So the question is, what is this built out of? This is just regular 3/4 inch PVC. My student worker actually put this together for me. We've got regular bird netting. It's zip tied around it, and I could just pull this apart. There's no primer, no glue. You can pull it apart, put it away, and this is something that's very feasible to do if you've only got several plants. Again, we've got it completely protected, but at the same time, on top and all the sides, at the same time though, it's kept away from the plant. And of course, we would just go lift it up. It's really lightweight. We could lift it up if we want to go in there and pick. So birds are going to be our biggest problem. Let's see. Do we have any questions so far?
No, I think our online crew have been answering them.
All right, y'all are rocking it. Okay, let's talk a little bit about varieties. Okay, there are actually two different types of blueberries that we can grow in the South. So you've heard blueberries referred to as a native crop. This Vicinium ashii, they've reclassified it to another species name, but I'm still going to stick with Vicinium ashii, which is the rabbit-eye blueberry. Gets its name because when the fruit, or so I've read, when the fruit are kind of immature, they're turning pink before they turn purple, they kind of look like the eye of a wild rabbit, like a cottontail rabbit. So that's supposedly why they're called rabbit-eye blueberries. By the way, something I want to mention is these blueberries that I picked, you can see some of them have a little purple in them still. I have to pick kind of early because I'm fighting the birds. I'm trying to beat the birds to them. They still taste good, but if you can let these things really hang on the tree or the bush a little bit longer, the very last day or two, there's quite a bit of sizing. They get a little bit bigger, they get softer. There's some acid degradation, so they taste sweeter as well. So if you could let them hang a little bit longer, provided you can keep the birds and the varmints off, they're going to be a lot tastier too. Okay, so rabbit-eye blueberries actually originated in South Georgia, kind of the northern Florida panhandle going into southeastern Alabama. So in that sense, they are native. As you saw, these chilling requirements range from 350 to 700 hours. So it's something we can actually grow here in the South, and they're pretty good. There is another type of blueberry called Southern Highbush. This is primarily the northern Highbush, which is Vicinium corymbosum, but it's been bred with ashii. They've also it's also got some other species like Darlai crossed into it, and so basically they've taken the the blueberry up north, and they've added some genetics from southern species to bring it farther south, where it's adaptable or adapted to our warm conditions and our short, mild winters. Southern highbush blueberries, they tend to be smaller. If you look at the one back here, it's kind of hard probably to see from the picture, but usually they have kind of a more compact growth habit. The leaves tend to be a little different looking. You can see the veins a little more. They tend to be fairly early ripening, fairly low chill. They're also a little more temperamental. They have no tolerance for salinity. They really need acid soil, so they're a little more picky than the rabbit eye blueberries. Usually you can put these guys about 4 feet apart commercially in the ground, whereas rabbit eye get about, they get a little taller, a little bigger, so usually you're going to put them 6 to 7 feet apart. Now, of course, being in containers, obviously, they're going to tend to be a little smaller. A single plant in the field can produce about 10 to 15 pounds of fruit, which is really impressive for not a big plant. Now, keep in mind, though, by putting it in a container, it's going to be a little smaller. So we're probably looking at more like 5 pounds, maybe 8 pounds per plant. But we can still get some pretty good production out of these guys. And so the varieties that we recommend, I'll just kind of go through this really quickly. And if you look here, Prince is one I did not bring along. It tends to have some issues getting size. The fruit tend to stay a little bit small because they're so early. And if you notice, these continue to go up in chilling requirement, and they tend to also increase in ripening. Okay, so they'll ripen starting mid-May all the way into July. My personal experience growing these things for about 15 years in containers is that they tend to fruit earlier, they ripen earlier. I'll get fruit sometimes late April, early May, growing them in pots. So container fruit come off a little bit earlier. But you can see, depending on the variety, we can really stretch this out. I mean, we're looking at mid-May, June, July. We're looking at maybe 2 months to 2.5 months we can spread this out. And keep in mind, some of the southern highbush, like early bird blue behind me, can actually ripen even earlier.
Do you have to have more than one variety?
You read my mind, Lisa. Great question. So Lisa asked a very appropriate question, and that is, do you have to have more than one variety for fruit set? And the answer is, well, it depends. Like so many things in life, rabbit eye blueberries generally require cross-pollination. Tiff blue has a little bit of self-compatibility. If you look here, you see pollinizers. That is telling you the variety that you want to plant with this one to get pollination. So for example, Brightwell, it is getting pollinated by the cultivar Austin and Premier, and that simply means these other two varieties bloom at the same time. And if you look, generally you'll see that it's basically a reciprocal kind of deal. But the more varieties you have, the better off you're going to be. These are pollinated by bees. So if we look at a blueberry, and if I were to, I'm going to make a mess, but if you look in here, you see a lot of seeds in there. The size of the fruit, this is a berry. It's not like strawberries or blackberries where they're tricky. These are true berries. The more seed you get, the larger the fruit. So the size of the fruit is dictated by the number of seeds. Some people even say the number of times the flower is visited by bees. So you want to make sure you've got bees out there too, helping you out to make sure you've got good set and good fruit size. By the way, many people prefer southern highbush. I know the birds, and myself included, prefer southern highbush over rabbit eye just because they tend to have less fiber. The skin isn't as tough. The seeds are smaller and less noticeable, but they're both really good. So let's see. So this is one here called Early Bird Blue. I got this from Dr. David Creech, who's they've done a lot of work. He's been a real leader in blueberries over at Stephen F. Austin State University in Nacogdoches. Nacogdoches has a blueberry festival every year. It's sometime late May or early June, I believe. And so this is a variety that was released jointly between the USDA and Stephen F. Austin. And this has a cool history because the plant that I had happened to be the last plant, and so they thought it was extinct, but I was able to get it back to Dr. Creech, and he was able to start more cuttings. But they're really fun to grow. I like growing a lot of different varieties. Let's go ahead and talk about planting, okay? One thing you'll notice, this is a Lapaha, which is kind of a mid-season variety. I really like this one. I've been looking for it for a while for at home, my own plant. I got this one at one of the box stores, I don't remember where. It's basically in a 1-gallon container, and if you're wondering how long it takes for these to produce, well, there's your answer. It's already producing, and this is about a 2-year-old plant, basically, is what you're going to buy. So again, 25, 30-gallon container, like you see here. So this is that composted pine bark. Now you want to make sure this material is cheaper generally than peat moss. I like it because it hangs around a little longer than peat moss, and it's fairly cheap. You can get it in bulk. But notice this is composted. It's been run through, it's chopped up, ground up, and it's allowed to sit and decompose for a while. Do not use regular pine bark. Okay, if you use just regular bark, then you're going to end up with a lot of nitrogen deficiency. You want it to be already broken down. You can see how this looks a little bit like potting soil too. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to go ahead and kind of make a little bit of a hole. I'm going to take my plant, gently take it out. We want it to be watered first. Okay, for most woody plants that have been in a container, we can have issues with root circling and J-hooking, where basically the root system is just really, it's starting to circle and wrap around, and ultimately these roots can kind of strangle themselves, which is not a good thing. But remember, I mentioned that blueberries have a fairly shallow and fine root system, so you don't see any major roots that are circling. Still doesn't hurt to break it up just a little bit though. However, if I did see a lot of root circling, you know, I could break it up or even take some pruners and make about 3 or 4 vertical cuts on the side. Okay, so this one is about ready to go. I'm going to plant it at the same depth it was originally growing. Now I know it's a little higher. I have another pot here. Another tub of the same material. I'm going to get in trouble for making a mess over here, getting this perfectly clean decomposed granite, getting it dirty. But so I'm just going to go ahead and add a little more soil to it to where it's at the same height basically. I like to have it as full as possible because remember it's going to break down and eventually the soil volume is going to decrease. But at the same time, you want a little bit of what we call a reservoir here to hold water, to hold fertilizer. So that's pretty good. You can see the edge, you can kind of see the edge of the original root ball. I've got it centered. It's good to go. All right, so I'm going to make some people squirm and gasp and shriek, okay? I'm going to cut off these beautiful fruit. So for the first year, just like most of our fruit crops, we want these plants to invest in vegetative growth and a root system. We want them to grow the bush so it can produce more fruit later on. There's a payoff, okay? I could just rip these off too, okay? This is especially true for southern highbush. Generally when we plant, especially on bare root, we're going to kind of remove some of this more kind of wispy type growth and just mainly leave some of the the sturdier looking branches. Remember, like I talked about earlier, that's also kind of helping the root system out. It doesn't have as much top to support. You may also go and tip these back a little bit. You can buy plants either bare root or containerized. Most of the time as homeowners, you're going to see these in 1 or 2 gallons. That's how you're going to buy them. The good thing about getting them in containers is you can grow them, you can plant them fairly late in the year. Right now is a little bit late. It's not a great time. Normally we want to have this done by March or April, but it still will work. This plant is still going to survive. It's still going to be okay. All right. So then, of course, we would water this in really well. Oops, I'm getting tangled up on my leash here. We would water it in really thoroughly. Remember, this material, like peat moss, it takes a while to really get it hydrated. So we want to make sure we're watering it with good quality water. In our case, that's going to be rainwater here. Water it in really well.
What if they have like a RO system or a filter at their house? How much
does
that help?
Yeah, good question. So Lisa asked the question, what if someone at their house has an RO system? RO stands for reverse osmosis. And so reverse osmosis is you can get under the sink models that'll put out enough water for kitchen use. that'll certainly work. That's basically the water is being forced under high pressure through a selective membrane, and you're getting mostly water running through. So it takes out basically all of the bad stuff, the sodium, the calcium, the carbonates, bicarbonates. Just using a filter is not going to take the sodium out. It'll take some stuff out, but if you're just using like a Brita filter or like a cartridge filter or even a strainer, that's not going to do much good against sodium. So typically you're looking at using either reverse osmosis water, which you can do, but it gets kind of expensive on a large scale. The easiest way, again, is rainwater, but RO, especially if you've just got a plant or two, absolutely will work great. All right, let's talk about fertilizer a little bit, okay? Blueberries are fairly light feeders. Remember that I said they're very sensitive to salt, okay? Fertilizers are salts, okay? Just remember that. They may not have sodium chloride, table salt, but ammonium sulfate, ammonium nitrate, potassium phosphate, those are all salts that potentially could burn the root system, so we want to be careful. Blueberries, we really want to feed them slowly, give them a little bit at a time. So for that reason, I personally like to use Osmocote. There are other brands out there. This particular one has a ratio of 15:9:12, so that's nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. But this is Osmocote Plus, which also has micronutrients in it, which is kind of nice. The Osmocote Next Generation also does too. But again, there are a lot of other brands out there. This is just the one I happen to have. The other thing, if you're using a slow-release fertilizer like this, pay attention to this number, okay? And it'll tell you this is 3 to 4 months. That's how long you can expect the fertilizer to be releasing nutrients before it peters out and you need to replace it. So you're looking at, with this one, maybe 3 applications per year. We want to start right before the plants bloom, and generally late summer, early fall, we want to have that fertilizer going. We want to have it play out, okay? All right. Of course, you could go with something organic. You could use a compost or something like that. Fish emulsion. There's a lot of other stuff you could use. Now, if you look here, what's nice is this tells you. This takes all the guesswork out of it. It tells you exactly how much fertilizer to use. So remember, I said this is a 25-gallon pot, or at least that's what I'm estimating. So if I find 25-gallon and come over. Now there's a low, medium, and high. High rate would be for plants that are very heavy feeders. For blueberries, I'm usually going to do somewhere between low and medium. This plant, I really am trying to push it. I want it to grow, but again, I don't want to push it too much and give it too much fertilizer, so I'm not going to go with a high rate. I like to use the medium rate, which if I'm lining it up correctly, that's 250. 250 grams. And so usually what I'm going to do, it'll also tell you approximate measurements for, like, say, a tablespoon or something like that. I usually just go with milliliters. So I'm going to take my measuring cup, about 250. And this is kind of the lazy way to do it, but it works. So about 250 there. So I'm going to take it and spread it out kind of in a circle around the plant. I've got to make sure I wash this measuring cup before I put it back. I'm going to get in trouble. So what this is going to do, this slow release fertilizer, these little preels as they're called, they have a membrane. Water gets pulled in through osmosis to the salts that are inside. The salts get hydrated, they dissolve, they start leaking through actually, and these things will swell up much larger. They'll get about this size, and they'll start releasing nutrients. And so again, you can expect them to release for about 3 to 4 months. I've found that in our climate, it's probably more like 2 to 3 months because it's hot, it's humid, and it also depends on how much rain you get too. Now, it's really encouraged, it's really recommended when you're growing blueberries in the field to make sure that you're using mulch. We recommend as much as 4 to 6 inches of mulch around the plants, and it's still, even in containers, will help quite a bit. I just happen to have some old pine straw around, actually grab this out of one of the beds back by the building. I'll have to return it. But I like using pine straw. Pine straw makes a great mulch. You could also use pine bark. And the reason I'm talking about these two types of mulch, I mean, there's hay, there's wood shavings, there's hardwood mulch, a lot of other types of mulch. But the good thing about pine bark and pine mulch is it's naturally very acidic, and it's going to help to maintain that 4.0 to 5.5 pH that we want to keep. So not only is it going to help with that, but as it breaks down, it's going to release some nutrients. In this pot, which is really surrounded by air, the sun is going to hit it, it's really going to get hot. This is going to help to modify the soil temperature, keep it a little cooler. It's also going to retain moisture as well. Okay. I brought a sample, but I forgot to bring it with me out here. But if you ever see a plant, and remember we talked about iron chlorosis, that's telling you that there's a problem. Most likely, again, if you've got the veins are green, the rest of the leaf is yellow, that's telling you probably that your soil pH is getting too high. You're going to have to add some iron. You may want to try to acidify the soil. The other thing is, if you see the edges of the leaves, it'll look kind of like this, but if the leaves just look kind of burnt all along the edge, especially on the tips, if you start to see a lot of that, that is an indicator that the plant is suffering from salinity stress. Okay, so that would happen here after about 2 to 3 weeks of watering with our College Station water high in sodium. We would see the leaves burning on the edges. And so let's say for a while maybe your rainwater runs out. This happened to me last summer, and I had to start using tap water. What's going to happen is you're going to start building up sodium in the soil. There he goes. I think the mockingbird's mad that he can't get in there. Anyway, yeah, you can see the mockingbirds at work already. But what happens is if you start accumulating sodium, you start accumulating salts inside here. And so what you're going to need to do if that happens is take a hose, set it on top of here, let it run slowly for at least 10 minutes to where you're flushing out, you're leaching out that salt that is in here. You want to push, you want to saturate the soil and push those salts out, and then water it again with your rainwater or your RO water or whatever your good water is. Pruning, generally there's not a lot of pruning necessary on blueberries. However, again, for the first couple years, you do want to go and kind of prune back to this these more erect and stronger shoots. Again, they'll try to make fruit right away, but you want to remove fruit for the first 2 or 3 years. Plants don't really start to hit full size and start really getting full production until at least year 6. And so once you get a mature plant, let's go back over here. When you've got a mature plant, we're going to prune during the dormant season, and what we're going to go after are these older canes. We do basically what's called a cane renewal, cane rejuvenation pruning. So you can see all these canes right here, they're coming up, they go straight up and then they kind of branch out. Blueberries, like many fruit, produce on 1-year-old wood. Okay, so the material that's growing now is going to produce our fruit next year. So we want to make sure, just like on peach, we're stimulating lots of new wood. So once we start seeing some older stuff, you can kind of see back here. Here's one that I pruned off earlier, but when you start seeing this kind of gray bark, the bark is exfoliating, it's getting older. On a mature plant, you're usually going to remove 1 to 3 canes, generally about 20% of the canopy, and you select these old canes. You're going to cut off and remove. So you're thinning out these canes, 1 to 3 canes, usually a year. Do this in the dormant season, in the winter time, and you're going to remove them. Okay. Like I said, this is going to stimulate, invigorate the plant, produce more fruiting wood. It's also going to help to kind of limit the amount of fruit that you get too, to kind of keep the fruit crop in check a little bit too. The other thing is, sometimes if we look over here on this climax bush, you can see some of these shoots can get a little bit tall, or these canes rather. If you get some that are kind of unwieldy, that are hard to work with, especially if you're trying to cover them, you can tip these back to make sure they're not going above 6 feet. Keeps them in harvesting at a harvestable height, and just helps keep the plant in better shape, and it's easier to protect too. So that's really about it on pruning. The only other thing is sometimes plants, I've had some of my 10-year-old plants that really start to get old. They start to kind of peter out. Sometimes you have to really cut them back hard to really push them and really get them to rejuvenate, to really reinvigorate them. So, and so really, as you can see, blueberries are easy fruit to grow. They really don't have a lot of pests and disease problems. The main thing, soil pH, water quality, and frost and birds. Okay, so again, we take care of the soil issue by growing in a containerized system. We grow them in a 20 to 30 gallon container with usually a peat moss, pine bark. You may have some sand in there. Make sure we give them good quality water. If you're not sure, you can go send in your water sample to the soil testing lab. Rainwater is a great option. Again, go to that rainwaterharvesting.tamu.edu website. Rainwater, really, for most people in Texas, or at least a lot of areas like here, it's the only way to guarantee you're going to have good quality water for them. Let's see. Birds, again, we can take care of birds with bird netting. If you can have a structure, build a structure like this, it's going to make it a lot easier on you, and it's just going to work out a lot better. And again, you may have to go and cover them if you have a late spring frost coming too. This material, especially if you can do it in layers, works really well. So, some of you may have a question about where to purchase plants, where to get them. You can order from places like Womack Nursery. There are other nurseries where you can buy bare root plants in the wintertime. Remember, bare root we have to plant early, January, February. We don't really want to go much later than that. But you can also go, I found that you can find a lot of blueberries too in 1 or 2 gallon plants from nurseries as potted plants too. So really that's about it. Do we have any questions?
No, I think that our online people have answered them. So
y'all are awesome. Thank y'all.
Awesome. So thank you, Tim. Thank you everyone for joining us, and we'll be looking for you guys to join us on Friday. We have a great session planned for Friday, mocktails and cocktails from the garden to the glass.
And I've even heard that Janet may even be including some blueberries in there too. So another way to enjoy blueberries. So thank y'all for tuning in. I hope you learned a lot. Again, this will be online for you to view later on too.
Thank you.